You think nobody's watching. You think this is just you alone grinding in a room nobody important will ever walk into. No cameras, no audience, just you, your work, and the silence you've gotten used to mistaking for invisibility. Shh. You're wrong. Somewhere out there, people whose approval you haven't even dreamed of chasing have already noticed you. Quietly, carefully, and they're not just watching, they're impressed. Let's talk about what that actually means and why you need to hear it today. Here's something almost nobody tells you about how influence actually works. Before we start, I have a message for those who believe this work matters. This channel has recently been demonetized, but sometimes challenges reveal the true strength behind a mission. Without ad revenue, we now rely on the support of the people who believe in these messages. And for those who want to go deeper, I created something special. The complete 6-book bundle. The Joker Mindset, The Iron Mind, The Silent King, The Lone Wolf, The Mind Architect, Borrowed Time. A complete collection built around one idea. A stronger mind creates a stronger life. 6 books covering discipline, confidence, resilience, influence, and personal transformation. For a limited time, you can get all 6 books together at a discounted price. The link is waiting in the description, and if these videos have brought value to your life, you can also support this mission through the Super Thanks button. Your support allows us to keep creating, keep sharing, and keep reaching those who need these messages. Thank you for being part of this journey. Now, let's begin. The people at the top of any room, any industry, any field, any circle worth being part of are not spending their time looking at the loudest people in it. Loud is easy to find and usually easy to dismiss. What they're actually scanning for, quietly in the background of every room they enter, is consistency. Someone who shows up the same way, whether or not the stakes are high. Someone whose effort doesn't fluctuate based on who's in the audience. That's you, more often than you realize. While you've been assuming nobody credible is paying attention, somebody credible has been doing exactly that. Clocking the way you handle setbacks, the way you keep showing up after a bad week, the way you don't need applause to stay consistent. They don't announce it. People at that level rarely do. But the observation is happening, and it's happening more than you think. Let's get specific about what actually earns that kind of attention, because it's not what most people assume. It's not the highlight reel. Anyone can look impressive for a moment. A good post, a lucky break, a single win captured at the perfect angle. High-status people have seen 1,000 highlight reels, and they've learned, usually the hard way, that a single great moment tells you almost nothing about a person's actual character or staying power. What actually gets noticed is the boring middle, the unglamorous stretch where nothing dramatic is happening, where the outcome is still uncertain, where most people either quit or start performing for an audience that isn't watching yet. Staying steady to that stretch, not loud, not desperate for validation, just quietly consistent, is rare enough that it stands out precisely because almost nobody else is doing it. People who built real influence recognize that rarity instantly because they lived through their own version of it once. They know what it costs, and when they spot someone else paying that same cost without complaint, without needing an audience to witness it, something in them takes notice. Not because they're being generous, but because they recognize the real thing when they see it. Here's why this observation stays invisible for so long, and why that's actually a good sign, not a bad one. High-status people rarely reveal their interest early, not because you're withholding it out of cruelty, but because premature attention changes behavior. The moment someone knows they're being watched by someone influential, the temptation to perform kicks in to start adjusting choices based on an audience instead of genuine conviction. So the people doing real evaluation tend to stay quiet on purpose, giving you room to keep being exactly who you already are, unfiltered before they ever let you know they've noticed. That means the silence you've been interpreting as absence might actually be patience, a kind of respect, even disguised as distance. The fact that nobody's reached out yet doesn't mean nobody's paying attention. It might mean they're simply waiting to see if the consistency holds up over enough time to trust it. Think about how this plays out in specific, ordinary moments because it's rarely as cinematic as people imagine. It's the senior person in the room during a presentation who says nothing in the moment but remembers exactly how you handled the one question that caught you off guard. Not the perfect answer, but the composed one. It's the investor scrolling past 100 pitches who pauses slightly longer on yours. Not because it was flashiest, but because something about the way you describe the hard parts, the actual obstacles, read as more credible than the polished version everyone else submitted. It's the mentor-shaped stranger at an event who watches how you treat the person nobody else in the room is paying attention to and quietly decides right then that you're worth a second look without ever mentioning it to you directly. None of these moments come with a receipt. You don't get a notification that you were noticed. That's exactly why so many people give up right before the observation would have turned into something real. They mistake silence for disinterest when it was actually evaluation still in progress. There's a reason people who've already reached a high level of success develop such a sharp eye for spotting it in others, and it comes down to something most people never think about. They've been burned by the alternative more times than they can count. Anyone with real influence has at some point invested time, money, or trust in someone who looked impressive early and collapsed the moment things got difficult. They've watched talented people flame out from lack of discipline. They've backed confident people who turned out to be all surface, no foundation. That experience teaches a hard lesson, repeated enough times to become instinct. Impressive moments are common and mean almost nothing on their own. What's rare and what actually predicts whether someone's worth betting on is whether the effort holds steady once the excitement wears off and the real work begins. So when someone with that kind of experience spots a person who keeps showing up unglamorously without needing to be seen, it registers differently than it would to someone without that history. It's not admiration for talent. It's recognition of something they've learned through expensive mistakes is actually rare. Sustainable effort that doesn't require an audience to keep functioning. That's the exact quality you've probably been undervaluing in yourself. Because it feels ordinary from the inside, it rarely feels ordinary from the outside to someone who spent years watching it fail to show up in almost everyone else. Consider too how differently this observation plays out depending on the field you're in, because the specific shift, even if the underlying pattern stays the same. In creative work, it's the person who keeps making things during the years when nobody's paying attention, refining a craft nobody's asked them to refine, simply because stopping was never actually an option they seriously considered. Someone established in that field, scrolling past hundreds of unnoticed portfolios, eventually recognizes that specific texture of persistence. Not because it's flashy, but because it's the same texture they remember from their own unnoticed years. In business, it's the founder who keeps iterating quietly after an idea fails to gain traction, adjusting instead of abandoning, staying in the game long after a reasonable observer might have expected them to fold. Investors who've seen enough failed pitches develop a specific radar for that particular kind of resilience, because it's the single strongest predictor they've found for eventual success. Stronger than the idea itself, stronger than the idea itself, stronger than the initial traction, stronger than almost anything else they can measure. In any field built on relationships, it's the person who treats every interaction with the same integrity regardless of who's in the room. The version of consistency that eventually becomes impossible to ignore because it shows up in enough rooms over enough time that word starts to travel on its own. Different fields, same underlying signal. The pattern doesn't change, only the costume it wears does. Now here's the trap, worth naming clearly because it's easy to fall into the moment you start believing this is true. Don't let the possibility that you're being watched become the reason you keep going. That's a subtle but important distinction. If your consistency starts depending on the hope that someone important is noticing, you've quietly rebuilt the exact dependency this whole idea was supposed to free you from. Needing an audience, just an invisible one this time instead of a visible one. The actual value of staying consistent isn't the observation it might earn, it's the person it builds you into, regardless of who's watching. High-status people are drawn to that exact quality. The fact that you weren't performing for them in the first place. The moment you start performing for an imagined audience of important onlookers, you lose the very thing that made you worth watching to begin with. So hold this truth loosely. Let it encourage you on the hard days without letting it become the engine driving the whole operation. The engine has to stay the same one it's always been. Your own reasons sturdy enough to run without applause? There's a question worth asking yourself honestly here, because how you answer it determines whether this idea actually helps you or quietly starts working against you. If you found out with total certainty that someone influential had been watching your path for the past year, would your behavior change? Would you suddenly become more careful, more polished, more curated in what you let people see? If the honest answer is yes, that's worth sitting with, because it means some part of the version you've been presenting wasn't the full truth to begin with. It means there's a gap between the private version of you and the public one, and that gap is exactly the thing sharp observers are trained to detect. The people who benefit most from this kind of quiet observation are the ones whose answer to that question is genuinely no. The ones who realize upon reflection that nothing would actually change because there was never a hidden version being managed for an audience in the first place. What you'd show a room full of influential onlookers is the same thing you've been showing an empty one. That alignment between the private self and the public self is rarer than people think. And it's precisely what separates someone who merely looks consistent from someone who actually is something else worth understanding. The observation doesn't stop once it turns into an actual opportunity. If anything, it sharpens. Plenty of people manage to get noticed, get the meeting, get the introduction, get the door held open, and then relax the moment it happens, treating the observation as something they've already passed rather than something ongoing. That's a mistake that costs people opportunities they don't even realize they're losing, because the same scrutiny that noticed them in the first place doesn't switch off the moment contact is made. If anything, it intensifies because now there's something concrete to evaluate instead of just a pattern observed from a distance. The people who actually convert quiet observation into lasting opportunity are the ones who understand this instinctively, who keep showing up with the same consistency after being noticed as they did before, who don't suddenly relax into a performance now that there's finally an audience worth performing for. The evaluation was never a one-time event with a clear finish line. It's ongoing for as long as the relationship or opportunity continues to matter. That's not exhausting news if you've actually built the habit correctly. If your consistency was never dependent on being watched in the first place, there's nothing new required of you once the watching becomes visible. You just keep doing what you were already doing. The thing that got you noticed to begin with continues to be the thing that keeps you worth watching. There's something else worth understanding about how this kind of attention eventually surfaces, because it rarely arrives the way people expect. It doesn't usually show up as a dramatic introduction, someone walking up to you and announcing, "I've been watching your journey and I'm impressed." Real influence tends to move quieter than that. It shows up as an unexpected message from someone you didn't think knew you existed. A door that opens without an obvious explanation. An opportunity that finds you instead of the other way around. Arriving with just enough context to make you realize someone's been paying closer attention than you assumed. By the time it becomes visible, the observation has usually been happening for longer than you'd guess. Sometimes months. Sometimes years, which means statistically, if it hasn't shown up yet, it might already be in progress right now, quietly building toward a moment you haven't reached yet. Here's a truth worth sitting with, especially on days when the invisibility feels heaviest.